How did George Foreman become the oldest heavyweight champion in history? We are going to break this down into 3 phases. Phase 1. Who George Foreman became in his second career. Phase 2. His fight with Evander Holyfield. Phase 3. That glorious night against Michael Moorer. Outside the ring, Foreman had charisma. Inside the ring, he had dynamic power. To see his power, look at the fight against Joe Frazier. Look at the fight against Ken Norton. George was a formidable force with absolutely unbelievable power. Chapter 1. The new George Foreman. George Foreman made a comeback in 1987. In his comeback, there were some changes. First of all, he was significantly bigger. This meant he could absorb punches better. Also, George Foreman had developed better boxing IQ. He had a better rhythm, better timing, and he understood his pace. He also introduced the cross-arm defense to his style. Ken Norton used the cross-arm defense in his sensational fight with Larry Holmes. For those that don't know, the cross-arm defense was associated with Archie Moore, another boxing legend. In my opinion, the cross-arm defense provides extra protection. With George Foreman's size, this defense was optimal. George Foreman also made adjustments to his punching style. Historically, George Foreman would load up on punches and telegraph the delivery. Now, however, George Foreman would shorten his punches. Because of his power, even his arm punches had incredible force. Because Foreman shortened the trajectory of his punches, they were harder to read. This was part of his boxing intelligence. By walking his opponents down, George Foreman could corner them. Because of his power, once in punching range, George Foreman could deliver punches with tremendous force. George Foreman first fought Evander Holyfield for the world title. This was an interesting matchup. George had the power, but Holyfield had the quickness. So there were obvious questions. Can Holyfield take George's power? Can George deal with Holyfield's speed? In the first round, Holyfield used beautiful movement and a sharp counter double jab. Evander respected George's power and spent a significant amount of time out of range. Let's get to the second round. George winds up a left hook to the body, and Evander dances away with a half step. George repeats the sequence and finds the target, but the punch is low. Evander is throwing jabs, but every now and then he sneaks in a vicious left hook to the body. A short left hook puts Evander on the ropes. George at times finds his range and lands some hard punches. Now, however, George Foreman would shorten his punches. Because of his power, even his arm punches had incredible force. Because Foreman shortened the trajectory of his punches, they were harder to read. This was part of his boxing intelligence. By walking his opponents down, George Foreman could corner them. Because of his power, once in punching range, George Foreman could deliver punches with tremendous force. Let's talk about round 7. George gets in range and throws vicious short hooks. He also uses the cross-arm defense as his go-to guard. George then unleashes a 4-punch combination. Evander, using the Philly shell defense, waits patiently, bends his legs, and fires back with a short left hook. Evander follows up with a barrage of punches, an incredible display of speed, timing, and aggression. This was a common strategy for Evander. He would sit in the pocket, absorb his opponent's punches, and when they stopped throwing, he would unload a series of hurtful shots. Both warriors showed unbelievable strength and resilience in this round. In this moment, George Foreman proved the legitimacy of his return, while Evander Holyfield showed that he was a true warrior in every sense of the word. This was an incredible round. Even though George lost this fight, he showed that he was still world class. George Foreman fought to the end. He never gave up and remained fiercely competitive throughout. Even in round 12, Foreman was throwing big shots, still hunting for the knockout. The truth is, George Foreman would have beaten a lot of men that night. So let's talk about Michael Moorer versus George Foreman. There were some important factors in this fight. Foreman was 7 pounds lighter for this fight than he was for the Holyfield fight. This illustrates that George Foreman was in good shape. It's also important to note that Moorer was a good champion, but foot movement was not his strongest attribute. This meant he was an easier target to find than Evander. But Moorer was a southpaw, which added another strategic variation to the fight. Let's go straight to round 3. In round 3, Michael Moorer threw 72 punches, landing 40 with a 56% connection rate. George Foreman threw 57 punches, landed 20, and had a 35% connection rate. This says a lot about the fight, so let's break it down into phases. Phase 1. Michael Moorer used to be a light heavyweight, so a high work rate is second nature to him. Phase 2. George Foreman is also throwing more punches than usual, which indicates good conditioning. Phase 3. At this point, Michael Moorer is winning the battle of the jabs, but this is a dynamic contest. Phase 4. In my opinion, Michael is staying in punching range a bit too much. In simple terms, it's too easy for George to get the right hand off. I feel like it should be more difficult for George Foreman to get into punching range. Ultimately, Michael Moorer's willingness to stand in range played right into the hands of one of the most powerful punchers in boxing history. So let's go to round 10. George is using the jab. When he throws the right hand, it's short and fast. Unfortunately for Moorer, George is throwing a lot of them. George also alters his attack pattern with the short right hand and a strong left hook. So Michael Moorer is dealing with two variations of attack. The fast, short right hand, often set up with the jab, or a softer right hand used to set up a short, hard left hook. George is using his left hand to try and control Michael Moorer's southpaw jab. A short 1-2, followed by another 1-2, and Foreman becomes the oldest heavyweight champion in history. The execution of the knockout was so impressive. The right hand had such a short trajectory. It was the perfect punch at the perfect time, delivered by a master of timing and power. He also had the stamina to repeat the combination in succession. This shows confidence, tactical awareness, and of course, his brutal power. This was an amazing achievement. Boxing is a very unforgiving sport, but George Foreman had evolved his technique. By increasing his boxing IQ and maximizing his strengths, particularly his power, he had become a formidable force. He also had a great team around him. Angelo Dundee, the man who trained the great Muhammad Ali, and the great Archie Moore. George trained using typical boxing methods: heavy bag and speed drills, long distance runs, skipping rope, and mindset conditioning. This was one of the greatest comebacks in heavyweight history. And for the record, George wore the same trunks that he wore when he fought Muhammad Ali in Africa. His journey was a lesson in reinvention, patience, and power. At 45 years old, George Foreman didn't just win a title, he redefined what was possible in the sport of boxing.
So I just wanted to go to video and just kind of add to the whole, to this whole thing with regards to George Foreman, who was a great fighter, a great champion. And I think I said this earlier, and I think it stands true, that George Foreman had two careers. and you could say he had more careers. But if you were to create a narrative bias of George Foreman having 2 careers, you would have the career where he had those sensational victories against Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, who both of those guys were great fighters. Both of them beat the great Muhammad Ali. So he obliterated, respectfully, both of them in 2 rounds. So in 4 rounds, he defeated 2 legends. So you had that career, and then obviously you had the Muhammad Ali fight, which is, that's something which is historical. It's in the books. Everyone knows about that fight. There's been documentaries made about it, films made about it, etc. So you have that portion. Then you have the fights after that, and then you have that 10-year layoff or 10-year retirement. So that's like phase 1 of the career, and then you have phase 2, which is the comeback. And this is when you have the 2 title fights against Evander Holyfield, another legend, and then against Michael Moorer, who was another great fighter. And obviously he fought other fighters as well, other notable fighters. I actually, before I put the camera on, I actually watched the George Foreman Joe Frazier fight, and then I watched the George Foreman Ken Norton fight, because I wanted to just refresh it in my mind. And actually, as I was watching this fight, and I took some notes, with the Joe Frazier fight, the video that I watched, they had that stare down at the beginning. So typically, obviously, before a fight starts, the referee gives you the instructions. And yeah, that was a fierce stare down between Joe Frazier and George Foreman. Both of them known as tough guys. I mean, objectively, to get in the ring, you've got to be tough, but it's like the toughest of the tough. And it was menacing. Now, the one thing I didn't remember, though, is that when they were fighting at the beginning in the first round, George Foreman was pushing a lot, and he was actually kind of like pivoting right and left. Like, his movement was much better than what I remembered. And in that fight as well, I noticed Joe Frazier's defense. He just gets really low, and then he fires that left hook counter. And because he gets so low, he's very, very hard to hit, extremely hard to hit. And watching that fight, the pushing and the movement I didn't remember, but what I did remember was the brutal punches, the brutal uppercuts. And there was multiple knockdowns in the Joe Frazier fight. One of the knockdowns was with a absolutely pulverizing right uppercut, which would have knocked out most heavyweights. So credit to Joe Frazier to get up. What a tough guy, what a tough man he is. And then there was another knockdown where he like throws a left hook and then throws like a right hook. And then it's like Joe Frazier moves with the left hook. So he moves to his left with the left hook, and then he gets punched with the right hook, and then he moves to his right, but kind of like is in the air. And it's just a phenomenal, that fight right there is a phenomenal demonstration of power. But even as, and this is again a credit to Joe Frazier, even though he was getting knocked down and whatnot, he still kept his composure. He was still low, and he was still trying to fire that counter left hook. So it takes a lot of stoicism to be able to do that while you're taking that type of punishment. So it was really good to kind of revisit that, because it was good to see how ferocious George Foreman was. And then I had a look at the Ken Norton fight, and as I was watching that, I was noticing how George Foreman uses his right hand to control things. Sometimes he'll push out both hands, but as he's stalking you and he's menacing, he's big, he's powerful, and he's just trying to control you with that right hand to nullify the jab and to kind of like pick off the punches, almost like a karate thing. And he uses it really effectively. And of course, wisely, Ken Norton, a great fighter. Remember, Ken Norton had an absolute incredible 15-round war with Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes another great champion who was reckoned to have one of the greatest jabs of all time. But I digress. But so Ken Norton was using movement, feinting, trying to use jabs, occasionally jabbing to the body. He was trying to get the left hook off. And again, he walked into like a brutal right uppercut. And, George was using that right hand, occasionally using the jab, occasionally throwing this thunderous right hook to the body. And then, again, in round 2, and I forgot about this, he actually landed on Ken Norton like a quadruple hook. I don't know if it was it wasn't a hook, but it wasn't an uppercut. It was like in between. But for the sake of argument, let's just call it a right hook. So he hit him consequently? Or concussively, I think you could use both. He just hit him consistently, that's the word. He hit him consistently with that right hand 4 times in a row. Again, big respect to Ken Norton to keep carrying on after that, because those punches looked thudding, absolutely thudding. And the second knockdown, if I remember correctly, I just watched it. It was like a sequence of uppercuts, and again it was ferocious, absolutely ferocious. What was interesting as well, the video that I watched, you could actually hear Muhammad Ali instructing Ken Norton, instructing him to use the jab. That's quite ironic because they fought on 3 occasions, I believe. Ken Norton won the first one and Muhammad Ali won the second and the third one. And another thing as well, what came across in those 2 fights to me was how menacing George Foreman was, because when he knocked him down and Ken Norton kind of rose at about 9, George Foreman just walked towards him. He just walked towards him with like this menacing stare. And then the referee kind of paused. And then there was like a pause, and then he just waved it off. And the way I interpreted that is George Foreman just walked towards him as if to say, right, if he's going to carry on, I'm ready to just deliver some more heat. He just looked really menacing. And I think those 2 fights really capture those 2 fights really capture how intimidating George Foreman was and how he punched phenomenally hard. These are against great fighters. Joe Frazier, Ken Norton, they have fantastic resumes. And it's interesting because when you talk about the first part of George Foreman's career, it was a part of his career where he was, to my understanding, he was not very popular. He was not a popular person. He was seen as very unpopular in the Muhammad Ali fight. If you had a narrative bias of the good guy and the bad guy, you would have Muhammad Ali as the good guy and George Foreman as the bad guy. Kind of similar to the Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield fight. In their first fight, Evander Holyfield was the good guy and Mike Tyson was the bad guy. And these narratives, they kind of fuel fights. They can fuel it. They can make a fight become more intriguing. It can add some spice, so to speak, to use a metaphor. And George Foreman, in that first part of his career, he was ruthless. And it's so interesting how the first phase of his career and then the second phase of his career, it's almost like he became this completely different person. And it's probably because he did become that completely different person, because the first phase of George Foreman's career was just straight serious. Just, there was no jokes to be had, really aggressive, kind of like a street guy. And the second version of George Foreman was someone who was cracking jokes, someone who could laugh at himself, and someone who really captured the American public. And I think there's a metric that you can measure his success by. There was a product, I can't remember, I think it was sold in the 90s, called the George Foreman Grill. And my understanding is the George Foreman Grill sold over 100 million products. And I think that's a testament to how popular George Foreman was. And on top of that, George Foreman became, I think, a great commentator. I've mentioned this in other videos, but his observations in the second Lennox Lewis-Evander Holyfield fight were the most insightful from any commentary team. I mean, he was the one who really was able to analyze the nuances and analyze what was going on and really give a really comprehensive breakdown as to how the fight was evolving and who was being effective. So he had great insight, which you would expect as a fighter, but not all fighters are able to articulate well on the microphone. But he was definitely good at that. Another one who's good at that is Paulie Malignaggi. He's really, really articulate when it comes to expressing the sweet science of boxing. So, you know, you had this transformation from someone who was very feared to someone who was loved. And I feel like everyone loved George Foreman. And then you had the performances as well. The Evander Holyfield performance, the Evander Holyfield fight was incredible. His performance was amazing. He would have beaten a lot of people that night. Evander in the third round, I think through, hit him with loads of punches and he just absorbed it and kept coming back. In the second round, he hit Evander Holyfield with a punch where Evander Holyfield allegedly said that he thought that George Foreman knocked all his teeth out. So imagine that, a man who fought Riddick Bowe, a man who fought Mike Tyson, a man who fought Lennox Lewis, a man who has an extensive resume of fighting thunderous punchers, put George Foreman as the hardest puncher. And he fought George Foreman when Foreman was in his 40s. And of course, in the seventh round, George Foreman gave an epic performance. And in that seventh round, he really put it on Evander. And to Evander Holyfield's credit, he took the punches, he absorbed it, and he came back. And then George Foreman absorbed that. And one thing you can say about that fight is at the end, George Foreman was still stalking. He was still looking for the knockout. And I feel like people don't give George Foreman enough credit for that incredible performance. And also, when he knocked out Michael Moorer, that was a very good performance as well. Again, I think there's this narrative bias that Foreman won, that Michael Moorer won every round and then Foreman just landed a lucky punch. I definitely didn't see it that way. Foreman came in lighter. He came in lighter than he did for the Evander Holyfield fight. And that fight was very competitive at points. And George Foreman, again, he was using the jab. He was trying to, if I remember rightly, he was trying to put his left hand on Moorer's shoulder to try and control the jab, because Moorer was a southpaw, so the trajectory of his jab is coming from a different place. It's coming from the right as opposed to coming from the left. And he was trying to control that, and he was engaging in the battle of the jabs. Yes, he was losing the battle of the jabs, but he was involved in it. And he was trying to, for a counter jabs, and he was, throwing that he was using that left to set up that straight right. And also what I liked is the little traps that he sent. Sometimes he would just put the left hand out there and then throw a really hard left hook. There was little traps that he was setting, and then he was throwing that hard left hook to the body. I thought it was a good performance by George Foreman, and clearly the knockout made history, made him the oldest heavyweight champion in the world, and that record still stands, I believe. So, George Foreman was a great fighter in both of his careers, in his first career and in his second career. Like I said, in 4 rounds he dispatched of Joe Frazier and Ken Norton. Both fighters went the distance with Muhammad Ali on, I believe, 6 occasions. I believe the only fight with Muhammad Ali that was stopped was the Thriller in Manila. So, George Foreman was a force to be reckoned with, and he gave so much to the sport in a variety of ways, and was a great fighter. So with that being said, RIP to the champ.